Well, the question of whether UK needs electoral reform is the biggest and hardest question, and it really depends on your perspective. And you could say that currently our election outcomes are highly disproportional, that they produce outcomes where the Liberal Democrats can get 23% of the votes but only 9% of the seats, and to many people that is simply unfair and unacceptable, therefore we need electoral reform. But on the other hand, other people would say that if you had that move to a more proportional system that would address that problem, you would create other problems. You would create the problem of having, or at least what some people see as the problem, of having endless coalition governments. And many people therefore would say that you don't need electoral reform. But on the other hand, first past the post, which has traditionally produced single-party majorities, increasingly is not doing that. We saw that very clearly in 2010 when it didn't produce a single-party majority. But the fact that the Liberal Democrats and the other minor parties have gradually been getting more and more seats means that that outcome is becoming more and more likely. So first past the post actually isn't doing what it's supposed to do. It isn't delivering the outcome of single party majorities. So you could argue on that side as well that, well, maybe actually we need to change the system in order somehow to encourage it to do what it's supposed to do. So there are many arguments about whether we need electoral reform, and there's no definitive answer. The main advantages of AV, I think, lie at the constituency level. Firstly, at the level of the individual voter, and then at the level of the constituency result. So for the individual voter, AV gives us a bit more choice. We can express our first preference, second preference, and so on, whereas with first past the post, we can't express as much of our preferences. So if you want that choice, then it's a good thing. And AV also means that there's a bit less pressure to vote tactically than there is under first past the post, whereas under first past the post, if you're a Green Party supporter, say, in most constituencies there's very little point in voting Green, so many of those people would vote tactically. Under AV, you can give your first preference to the Greens, but then vote, if you like, tactically for the big party that you prefer with your second preference. And AV also has the advantage, most analysts would say, of being more likely to choose the most popular candidate within a constituency. First past the post has the problem that how well a candidate does depends partly on how popular they are, but partly also on how many other similar candidates there are running in the race. So if there's one left-wing candidate but three right-wing candidates, even if there's a right-wing majority among the voters, it may be that the left-wing candidate wins because the right-wing candidates split the votes between them. AV is designed to prevent that outcome. So, at least in one important sense, that produces a fairer result in the constituency. There is no reason to think that AV would always lead to coalition governments. There are two ways of looking at this. We can look at simulations that have been done on what would have been the result of elections that have taken place had they been run using the alternative vote system. And those simulations, we have them going back to 1983, and they suggest that of those 7 elections since 1983, only one would have produced a hung parliament, that being the 2010 election, which of course produced a hung parliament under first past the post. Anyway, some of the simulations suggest maybe there would have been a hung parliament in 1992 as well, when the Conservatives under first past the post won with a very small majority, but that's not quite clear. But there's certainly no reason on those simulations to think that there would be permanent coalitions. The other way of looking at it is to think, well, actually maybe the effects of AV would be a bit more fundamental than that. Over the long term, as people kind of adjust their way of thinking in response to the change in the electoral system, we can't capture this change in simulations, that might lead to a more fundamental change in the party system. So you might get more parties, you might get the breakup of Labour, you might get the breakup of the Conservatives. In theory, that seems quite plausible as an effect of AV. In practice, the evidence that we have is that it doesn't happen. In Australia, it hasn't really happened. In other examples with similar electoral systems, it hasn't really happened. So all of the evidence tends pretty strongly to suggest that we would not get permanent coalitions with alternative vote. AV would not cost nearly as much to implement as the No campaign are suggesting. They've put out this figure of £250 million, but 91 million of that is the cost of the referendum, which is incurred whether there's a yes vote or a no vote. So if you take that off, then you're down to just over £150 million. Now, some of that is the cost of an education campaign to explain to people how AV works, and it is legitimate to say that we should have such an education campaign. They've allowed for a real big campaign with all whiz-bangs and fireworks and so on, but that's maybe not unreasonable. It is a more complicated, slightly more complicated electoral system. But the bulk of their figure comes from their claim that under AV we would need voting machines or counting machines, and those would be expensive. There's not the slightest reason to think that we would need such machines. Most AV elections around the world, in Australia, in Scotland, are held with paper ballots, counting the ballot papers by hand. That takes a little bit longer than counting first past the post, so it would cost a little bit more, but it wouldn't cost anything like £250 million. It's not unreasonable to look at Australia because basically the party system is fairly similar. There's a large party on the left with the Labour Party, just as in the UK. There's a large party on the right with the Liberal Party, which is the equivalent of our Conservative Party. I suppose the main difference is that we have the Liberal Democrats, who have been, at least until now, a pretty strong third party, and there hasn't really been a strong centrist third party in Australia. So that leads some people to question whether the Australian evidence is really valid. But apart from that, the Australian evidence is pretty good, except there's one point where the Australian evidence does fall down, and that's the point that Australia has compulsory voting. It has compulsory voting both in the sense that you have to turn out and vote, you get fined if you don't turn out and vote, and in most Australian elections you have to give all your preferences, so you have to rank all of the candidates, whereas in the form of AV that is proposed for the UK, you can rank as many candidates as you like. You can stop at one if you want. And there are certainly some differences there. For example, we can't see what might be the effects of AV upon turnout by looking at Australia, because Australia has compulsory voting, so of course turnout is much, much higher. But in terms of thinking about the effects upon the structure of the party system, AV in Australia and the UK would probably have fairly similar effects. No, I don't see any reason really to think that AV would tackle political disillusionment at all. I suppose part of the argument here is that AV would reduce the number of safe seats. The Yes campaign says in its more exuberant moments that AV would eliminate safe seats. AV would certainly not eliminate safe seats. Many safe seats would remain. Those seats where the winning party candidate is currently getting 50, 60, sometimes even 70% of the vote. These seats are not going to be affected in any fundamental way by AV. There is no reason to think that there would be a big change in political culture or in the nature of political campaigning. If you look at Australia, the two main parties are constantly scrabbling at each other just as fiercely as are the main parties in the UK. No, I don't think there's any reason to expect a fundamental change in engagement in political culture in anything like that. A move to PR, many people say, would at least lead to a slight increase in turnout at elections. So with PR, it's easier to see that your vote is making a difference, because each vote contributes to the election of someone for the vast majority of votes. With AV, that claim is being made, but it's not really. There is reason to think that proportional representation would increase turnout a bit. But if you look at the evidence on satisfaction with democracy, if you look at the evidence on whether people are becoming disillusioned with the state of their democracy, there really isn't much difference for any electoral system. There's not much evidence to suggest that the electoral system does have a fundamental impact on that. My view is that a change to AV now would probably increase the likelihood of further electoral reform rather than reducing it. If you have a no vote now, then that will be followed by what some political scientists call a battle of interpretation, interpreting the no vote. The supporters of first past the post will say, okay, the people have decided, that's it, the issue's off the agenda. The supporters of reform will say, well, actually the people were offered the wrong reform here. They were offered a meaningless reform. Now we need to push for PR, for a more serious electoral reform. Given that this issue has hardly captured the public imagination, given that the electoral system is a pretty esoteric subject that few people want to engage with, the task of the Yes campaign in trying to convince people that actually there's another system that would be even better and you need to keep on thinking about this, that's going to be a pretty hard ask. So I think the No campaign will be able to win that battle for interpretation. And therefore, if there is a no vote, then that makes electoral reform harder for some time to come. AV does have the ability to exaggerate landslide majorities. In 1997, it is pretty clear that Labour would have won even more seats than they did had an alternative vote system been in place. The same effect in the opposite direction would probably have happened in 1987 when the Conservatives had a very large majority, and that would have been a little bit bigger according to the simulations had we had the alternative vote in place. And the reason for that is essentially that second preferences go the same way as first preferences. So if there's a really popular party, then it will pick up lots of first preferences, but among those who don't vote for it first, a lot of them will swing to it second as well. And the key voters there in recent elections have been the Liberal Democrats, the voters for the third party, because in most constituencies their votes, their candidates are eliminated from the counting process and therefore their votes are redistributed. So in order to understand the overall effect of AV upon the two big parties, you have to see where are the second preferences of Liberal Democrat supporters going. And they tend broadly to follow the winning party. There's been a slight tendency in recent years for the Liberal Democrats to be biased a bit in favour of Labour. So it's easier for Labour to get a majority of Lib Dem second preferences than the Conservatives. But Labour had a big majority of Lib Dem second preferences in 1997. The Conservatives had a fairly small but nevertheless significant majority of Liberal Democrat second preferences in 1987. And that's why you tend to get the exaggeration of landslides under AV. The question of why people should turn out to vote on the 5th of May is a really interesting question. On the one hand, we have here, for the first time ever, the chance to decide our electoral system, and that is a fundamental part of our democracy. Normally, politicians control the electoral system, which is a bad thing, because perfectly understandably, the politicians are thinking in significant part about their own interests when they choose the electoral system. So it's great, finally, we as the citizens have the chance to decide our electoral system, and that's a really important reason for turning out. But on the other hand, the choice that we've been offered is a fairly meaningless choice. You know, it's a choice between essentially two variants of the same electoral system. Both first past the post and the alternative vote are non-proportional systems. They keep the single-member districts. They don't lead to proportional outcomes, and therefore, you know, the effects one way or the other on our political system as a whole are not going to be dramatic. So, you know, it is a pretty hard sell to convince people that it is important to go out there. I think it is because of the general point that the electoral system matters. But the particular choice of electoral system that we have here isn't, frankly, a very big one.